I'd like to call to order the meeting for the Tax Increment District Review Committee. I'd like to call it to order, please. Roll call.
Grody?
Yes.
Lute?
Yes.
Kirkpatrick?
Here.
Stegman?
Here.
Barry?
Here.
Denton?
Here.
Hector? Okay.
I'm here. Before we get started.
me? Schwank.
Schwank? Yep.
I'm here.
Yep, you are.
Do you want me to leave?
No. Still haven't learned
started,
all your all's names. I'm still learning.
I want to thank everybody for coming. Appreciate you taking time out of your day to come to the meeting so we can get some more information on the proposed TIF. Let's move on to item 2, approval of the minutes for April 2024. I'd entertain a motion.
I move to approve the minutes.
Second.
Second.
Roll call, please.
Grayson?
Yes.
Grody?
Yes.
Lutt?
Yes.
Kirkpatrick?
Yes.
Schwank?
Yes.
Stegman?
Yes.
Barry?
Yes.
Item number 3, discussion of the status of proposed tax increment district, including but not limited to A, proposed infrastructure improvements and related project cost, B, proposed development assumptions, C, draft Gateway of Chickasha Economic Development Project Plan.
All right, I think I have to put the password back in here. There we go.
Just took Rachel getting up.
I had instructions on how to do it. It worked. That's always good. Good afternoon, Nate Ellis, Public Finance Law Group.
To assist customer.
So today we've got a presentation that I'll go through. Some of it you've heard before, so I'll kind of move through some of it pretty quickly. We've got a draft project plan. We also have a draft resolution. I want to just go through those with you as well. It's not our expectation that we would actually take action today, but I went ahead and put it on the agenda. That way it's more of a preview. The idea that you'll be able to take those home with you, read them, digest them, and then we'd come back at a subsequent date and hopefully be in a position at that point to make a recommendation. So, any questions before we get started? All right. A little bit of delay when I hit the slide button. Okay, so we're talking about tax increment financing districts, which are authorized under the Oklahoma Constitution, the Local Development Act, and it apportions a portion of an increment of new tax revenue that's generated within a district to finance certain project costs. Can be for up to 25 full fiscal years. It's an economic development tool that's used to incentivize capital investment in undeveloped or undeveloped property. Purpose of enhancing the tax base and increasing employment opportunities. It's ultimately created by a city ordinance following the process. TIF districts can only be established in areas that are at least one of the following: reinvestment area, where you've got need public improvements to reverse economic stagnation or decline, serve as a catalyst to retain or expand employment, to attract major investment, preserve or enhance the tax base, or 50% or more of the structures are at least 35 years old. It could also include an area that's blighted, although blight is not a requirement of Oklahoma TIF statutes. It could also be a historic preservation area, or it could be an enterprise area. And the actual areas that we're talking about here actually do fall within a couple of different enterprise zones that have been designated by the Oklahoma Department of Commerce. So it does qualify on that basis, would also qualify as a reinvestment area. Ad valorem taxes from the base assessed value. Once a TIF is created, the county assessor determines the base value. whatever the taxes are off of that base value continue to accrue to the taxing entities. So it does not capture any of the existing taxes. It only captures new taxes. The increment is used to fund eligible project costs, which could include any number of different items, from a very public in nature to very private in nature, but some common ones that we see: land acquisition, infrastructure, parking, financing, and assistance and development financing, which might be in the form of direct incentives to a company or business, might be in the form of reimbursement of a company for incurring certain infrastructure costs. So it could potentially be any of those. It can include property tax, sales tax, and hotel tax, and it does not affect the tax rate, and it does not forgive the obligation to pay taxes. So whoever owns the property has to pay taxes on whatever the value is. The increment just determines what portion of it would actually get captured by the TIF district. So a basic model to kind of conceptualize, you see in the lighter green, you've got an existing tax base. So that's the revenue that's being generated, whether that's ad valorem or sales tax. That's kind of your historical tax generation that you have there. You have additional investment that generates an increment of new taxes, and that's the darker green. And so over time, that revenue builds up as the value increases. It's that increment that can be actually captured by the TIF district and utilized for the project purposes. And then when the TIF expires, then you have a new higher tax base, and at that point 100% of those tax revenues are flowing to the taxing jurisdictions. So some of the reasons that we look at creating a TIF district, we're looking at attracting major investment. Again, catalyst is for retaining jobs or creating new jobs, promoting economic development to enhance tax revenues, raise property values, improve economic stability, and then important, make possible investment in economic development and growth, which would otherwise be difficult or impossible without the assistance provided by the TIF. And that really amounts to a but-for test. And so that's kind of the litmus test. If we did not create the TIF district, would the same development occur to the same degree in the same manner? It doesn't mean that no development would ever happen forever. It just means that the TIF provides acceleration of that development, or maybe enhances that development in ways that aren't going to happen without the TIF district being in place. So the process to create a TIF, we have a review committee, which is this body. Contains representatives from each taxing jurisdiction. The city council has a representative, planning commission has a representative, and then 3 at-large representatives. We determine an increment area and project area. And so the increment area is the area where the incremental increase in tax revenues are collected and captured and used for the purposes. The project area is a much larger area where funds can be spent. We may have infrastructure improvements that are necessary outside of the increment district to support development within or inside the boundaries of the increment district. Then we prepare a project plan, which we'll talk about today. It's required by state statutes, outlines the eligibility, the budget, the desired outcomes, the administration, the financial impacts from the creation of the TIF, and has maps showing the project area and the increment area. Review committee meets to consider the project plan, ultimately makes a recommendation to the city council. Planning commission will also review and vote on the project plan, and then we'll have 2 public hearings. All of that has to happen, and once that process is complete, then and only then the city can consider adopting a TIF ordinance that would actually create the TIF districts, adopt the project plan, and put everything in place. So some other considerations that we look at: structuring the project plan to share some of the incremental revenues with the other taxing jurisdictions, especially school districts. And this kind of help balances the needs of, if we capture 100% of the growth, that potentially places undue burdens on any of the different taxing jurisdictions because they don't see any of that growth revenue, versus having some sort of revenue sharing helps benefit. It's kind of a win-win, and then at the end we've got an enhanced tax base. So that's really the concept, and as we've talked in previous meetings, we've ultimately looked at a 50-50 model of revenue where the TIF would capture 100% of the ad valorem, but 50% of it would be returned back to the taxing jurisdictions. And similarly with the sales tax and hotel tax at the city, half of it would be captured for the increment district purposes. The other half would go to the city for their normal operations and ordinance requirements. Carefully develop the increment area to make sure it includes properties that will increase in value. And I think we've talked about that some, and we'll see that when the map comes up. I mean, we've kind of carved out some properties that unlikely that they're ever going to develop. There are other properties that are in there that might or might not develop, and then there are certainly properties that we do anticipate will develop. The project area can be larger than the increment area. Again, that's where we can spend the revenues on projects anywhere within the project area. And in this case, we're talking about a project plan that actually includes more than one increment area. Each increment area or individual TIF district can be initiated at different dates, but must be activated within 10 years of the adoption of the project plan. So again, we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into the project plan. We include incremental sales tax and hotel taxes. And one of the benefits of doing that, one, it's an additional revenue stream that helps support the project costs, but two, it allows the city to access the Leverage Act, the Local Development and Enterprise Zone Incentive Leverage Act, where a portion of the state sales tax revenues can actually be accessed as matching funds to the local sales and hotel taxes that are contributed to the TIF project. So that's kind of an important element that it potentially double the amount of revenue that's, if the city is putting in half of its sales tax, half of its hotel tax, there's potential match of equal amount, and so it has a pretty significant impact on what the city is able to accomplish through the TIF district. That act can only be used inside of a TIF district, and there's ultimately a determination by the State Department of Commerce. They'll make a determination of what the net benefit to the state is, and then they will allow a match up to that net state benefit that they identify. So two primary components that we're talking about for the proposed gateway to Chickasha increment districts. We've got a downtown Chickasha project and then a Highway 62 corridor project. And again, we're talking about 50% of the ad valorem that would be captured for the TIF district, 50% being returned to the taxing entities, 50% of the 4 1/4 city sales tax, 50% of the 8% sales tax levied for hotel tax, and then 100% of any Leverage Act dollars that are received from the state that are matching funds to the state and hotel tax. There's identified project costs, as we talked about at the last meeting, of pretty large numbers, pretty significant infrastructure needs that the TIF may or may not ever ultimately completely accomplish, but the identified needs are about $581.6 million at this stage, and what are fairly, I think, nominal, very conservative revenue projections. We project that the TIF could generate close to $36 million in actual TIF revenue. Again, the objectives that we've talked about, these are similar to what we've talked about already. This is the proposed increment boundaries for the downtown TIF, and you'll see that there's kind of some properties carved out along the bottom. Those are some existing church properties primarily that we don't anticipate them doing anything with, or that church leaving, closing, whatever, and going somewhere else. And then the parcel that's carved out in the middle is actually the First National Bank property, which again, we don't anticipate them making any major investments to their property, so we're not expecting a large increase in value, if any, there. To the extent that they did, it's not included in the TIF district, so that would just be revenue that, if it generated additional tax revenue, it would accrue to all the taxing jurisdictions. So again, it didn't make sense to include that in there, but other property, especially, maybe smaller properties, we tried not to carve out just a bunch of individual smaller properties that maybe had fairly nominal value, but might or might not develop long term. So again, this encompasses the majority of the core of the downtown area. Then the Highway 62 corridor project. Of course, you've got the Turnpike interchange right there and Highway 62 as it comes into downtown. And so this picks up area that's around the interchange and then along that 62 corridor, and then also, forgive me, I've forgotten what street that is that heads south there off of 62. It's what? No, that's not 81 there. Grand Extension, okay. All right, so and along that is kind of a spur off of that main corridor there. And then the red area that you see, this is the project area that we've designated. So again, a much larger area. That doesn't mean that there's something that needs to be done in every single corner of that project area. Just kind of for convenience purposes, we tend to draw a box around the general area. And so infrastructure improvements that we would anticipate, especially utility infrastructure, would extend outside of those increment districts, but all be within that project area. And then you see where the two increment districts fit within that project area generally.
Inside that red box is where that 581 million came from, that number?
Yes.
Okay.
Any other questions on that? Before I jump off the map, we can put the map back up here in a little bit. But. Okay, so what we've done for project costs, we've got $551.6 million. I think at the last meeting, we had a one-page handout that had a summary of the different infrastructure, water, sewer, drainage, streets, and so these are the product of a number of different engineering studies, planning documents that have been done by the city or on behalf of the city, and then those dollars adjusted to be approximately $24. And so you see the breakout between water, sewer, stormwater, street and bridge. If you want to get into any of the details of that, I'm gonna let Scott or somebody else at the city handle that. Not my area, but then we've included then a 20%, approximately 20% contingency, anticipating that we're not going to be able to go out today and complete all these projects at $24. There's probably going to be some inflationary costs moving forward as as those projects are ultimately undertaken on a phased basis and based on what developments are actually ready to move forward and what they help support and what other resources there might be available to the city to help finance those costs. The assistance in development financing is a reimburse of project costs. This is contemplated as a potential business incentive number. The rationale for that is that's approximately what the expected leverage component would support. So you remember a few slides ago, we talked about the local revenue sources totaling about 36 million. About 30 million of that is hotel tax and sales tax, or the 50% that's allocated to the project cost. And assuming that there's 100% or potential of 100% match on that from the state, that's a quantity of dollars that might be available for assistance in development financing that, again, anticipated to be primarily incentive based. It's there, so this is something that the committee can kind of chew on and give feedback ultimately, but it seemed to be an appropriate number to tie it to if those are state dollars. One of the impetuses of the Department of Commerce that they've talked to a number of communities and projects is to try and use those leverage dollars for incentive type things, to try and get things to go in there that are more capital investment and result in more tax revenue being generated. Kind of, try and use those things to incentivize the project to go bigger than what is initially planned. So again, that's a proposed cost element. That, when we talk about assistance in development financing, what that typically means is there is a developer that is fronting some cost, and then they're receiving a payment from some portion of the TIF revenues into the future. So as an incentive, that might just be a payment that's performance-based, based on what they're generating, based on what, sales tax or hotel tax that their property happens to generate. It could also be a developer that goes in and does some portion of the infrastructure improvements that are the public components of the project. If it made sense that they're willing to invest their capital to do those infrastructure components that would be part of those other cost elements, and then they would be reimbursed over time out of TIF revenues. That sort of assistance in development financing, we wouldn't contemplate to be part of that 30 million. That would actually be part of the 551 million in projects. So I just want to make sure you kind of clarify and understand the difference there. So I'll stop there again. That's a good point for it if there's any questions in understanding.
I have a couple questions. My first question is the base year that you're going to use for the TIF. Is that after it's been approved, then do they determine the base year?
Yes.
So it would be either 24 or 25?
Yeah, it would be at the time, and we'll talk about this, but at the point in time the city adopts the project plan and creates the increment districts, we haven't yet activated them. So the city may or may not choose at that point to go ahead and activate one or both of the districts, or they may choose to wait until something is actually moving, a specific project is actually moving forward. So for example, it might be next year that they actually activate that increment district. At the point in time they activate the district, that's when the base assessed value would be calculated.
But they don't ever go backwards?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, so it would be based on whatever the valuation was at the time the district is actually activated. And they're required, if they're going to activate the district, they have to do it within 10 years of creation of the TIF district. So theoretically, they could wait till 2034 to activate a district, but hopefully that's not the case.
Then my other question is, if you're wanting this for economic development, and I mean, this is infrastructure stuff that would be necessary for the economic development, but we're looking at 500 million versus, I mean, we're just collecting a drop in the bucket. Do we have to make sure that there's money to finish these projects out? I mean, should there be other, does that make sense? I mean,
so yeah, so it's a good question. Let me answer it this way. When the city adopts a project plan, they have authorized the mechanism to capture the incremental revenue and dedicate it towards the payment of those project costs. They have not obligated themselves to spend $580 million. So, and obviously the city is not going to be in a position today to turn around and go issue $580 million worth of bonds and fund everything. It'd be great if you could do that, but it's not going to happen. So the city will need to work with development projects, identify development projects, and the infrastructure that's necessary to support those initial projects. And will the incremental revenues themselves be sufficient over time to provide a full payback of those, or will the city need to look at all other sources? I would anticipate that the financing of these costs over time would be some combination of tax increment revenue, but also other city resources, whether it's utility revenues or sales tax revenues and or grant funds that might be received at the federal or state level, and or any other sources that might be available. And they would prioritize the projects based on developments that are ready to move forward, and where can you get the best bang for your buck to get the projects off the ground. And then hopefully as development happens, you get more and more development, which is going to allow you to do more and more of the infrastructure projects along the way. I'm not going to stand here and reasonably tell you at this point that I think this is going to generate enough money over 25 years to pay all of these costs. That would be absolute dream victory scenario for Chickasha if that actually played out that way.
The way I see it, though, the reason we identified the 551 million is because, if we only identified 30 million, at that 30 million mark, that would cut off if the TIF generated more than that, right? Is that why you identify such a large amount? Or?
So, another good question. So, the 30 million ties back to, based on our initial revenue projections, there's about 30 million of that that's sales tax and hotel tax, and about 6 million of it, very round numbers, that's ad valorem tax. And so, based on that 30 million of local sales and hotel tax, you would hopefully have about $30 million in matching funds. For purposes of the project plan, we've identified that as an amount that's in there. The city would need to go through an amendment process if they wanted to increase that 30 million significantly for incentives. If, let's say, our revenue projections are half of what they actually turn out to be, and we actually get 60 million in sales and hotel tax, then assuming that the Department of Commerce has said you're going to have 100% match on that, then we would actually get $60 million worth of leverage revenues over that same amount of time. That would just be an additional $30 million, well, $60 million between the two sides that's available for the other infrastructure projects. So think of it in terms of, we anticipate, not to exceed 551 million of infrastructure, not to exceed 30 million of incentive. And, the city would always have the ability to kind of go back through this process and amend that should they feel compelled, or if the appropriate need arise, they would have that ability. But as it would be initially adopted, those would be the limitations that are put in place.
And that, to me, that ensures that the captured money's not all of it's used to go to developers or whatnot. It's actually what's matching is what we can use to incentivize. The rest does go to capital projects that we've identified that we need to get done.
Okay. The direct and administrative costs that would be eligible project costs that are payable from TIF revenue would include the organizational costs of creating the TIF districts, and then ongoing administrative costs. We've estimated those at not to exceed $10,000 per year per increment district over a 25-year time horizon. It might or might not be that much, but those would be eligible costs that the city could recoup through the TIF revenues. And then at the bottom, 780 million, that's a massive number, even more so, of interest and financing costs. That's what it might look like if we went out and issued $580 million worth of bonds today and paid them off for 25 years. At current interest rates, it'd probably be about $780 million of additional interest. So obviously that's not going to happen, but it is anticipated that somewhere along the line there will probably be some financing that's done by the city for certain infrastructure projects, whether it's directly under the TIF district, or if they finance those under their utility structure or a sales tax structure, and then utilize the increment revenues to pay whatever the allocable cost of that debt service is that's allocated to TIF projects. So again, and those are financing mechanisms that the city might be able to use to significantly lower what the interest costs are as well, to be able to obtain better financing. I've kind of estimated a not very efficient financing to come up with that number, but we want to extrapolate some number for purposes of project plan, just to have a potential outer limit.
I know we mentioned that 30 million being incentivized. That's going to be say it's all approved by council and it goes into effect. That's dependent upon the contract between the developer and the city, correct?
Yes.
How that all plays out.
Yes, that's another good point. And so anytime you have an assistance in development financing with a developer directly, there is going to be a separate development agreement that has to be entered into between the city or maybe one of its public trusts and that developer that's going to set out, all right, developer is going to build this and there's gonna be whatever performance measures built into that. And in consideration of that, the developer is going to get this incentive, which maybe it's a rebate of some portion of the sales tax that they generate over time, typically tied to some sort of performance indicator that, you know, they're gonna generate sufficient revenue to more than pay for what that incentive is that they're actually getting. So, I mean, in theory, if the city had the wherewithal to go out and finance certain infrastructure projects, they could do that without having any development agreements in place. But more than likely, especially at the front end of the TIF district, they're going to want development agreements with all of the with whoever the potential developments are, because the city's not going to want to put itself in a position to go out and expend a bunch of funds for projects that really aren't going to happen. They want to make sure if they're going to commit resources to that particular project, that the resulting development is certain. So,
And forgive my ignorance on this, but on these contracts we're talking about, I'm assuming Keith's going to be the one that's the main negotiator, but do they come before council to get approved, the individual contracts, or how does that?
yeah, they would actually come before council for approval. So, and again, whether it's Keith or your city attorney or myself or Kathy O'Connor or whoever might be involved in that process, potentially all of us. But yes, they would ultimately, the finished project or product would ultimately come to the city council for individual approval.
I was just curious because, TIF's approved, it's all clicking along, but council still does have final say on what kind of contracts we enter into that. Okay, good.
Very much the same way you've got final say-so to go out and build this water line or fix this street or whatever infrastructure project you might designate as important to moving all of it forward.
I just know that was going to probably be a huge question when this is proposed to council. What kind of, checks and balances are still left even after it gets approved? Okay.
Again, this puts the mechanism in place to capture this particular revenue source for these purposes, but the city still has to execute individual steps along the way to construct certain projects and to track certain developments and then put all of those in place.
I just want to make sure I'm understanding this right. That assistance in development, that would be a cost on top of those other projects, right?
Correct.
Okay, so what are we estimating that the TIF areas will actually make, and as far as
So based on the
income?
the preliminary revenue assumptions that we talked about at the last meeting, we think that it will generate about $6 million, very round numbers, about $6 million in ad valorem tax would be the 50% that's dedicated to TIF. The other $6 million would go to the taxing jurisdictions. Right. And then there would be about $28 million worth of sales tax that is half that's dedicated to the TIF, $28 million that's going back to the city, and then a couple million of hotel tax revenue captured by the TIF district, the other half, $2 million, going back to the city. So about $36 million in local revenue sources based on those projections, which again, they're fairly conservative. A lot of them are pushed fairly far out into the future. When you're dealing with a TIF like this, where we don't have one all-encompassing developer that has a specific plan with a specific timeline, we've got larger areas that are potentially developable by multiple different parties. Again, we're trying to be fairly conservative in our revenue projections, but that 36 million, the 30 million of which it is sales tax and hotel tax, could potentially be matched with up to $30 million of state sales tax funds through the Leverage Act. So that would be 66 million in that scenario.
And that's total through the 25 years.
That's total through the 25 years between the two, and obviously that would support maybe a tenth of all the projects that are listed up there. If
or just the assistance.
Yeah, and again, the city ultimately will make a determination. I mean, they're not obligated to provide 30 million in that. Any given project might be zero, or it might be something. I mean, that'll be future determinations that the council needs to make to determine, you know, what is necessary to get certain projects off the ground. But again, the contemplation is that that's an amount that would basically be funded out of those state leverage dollars that are coming back. That would, I mean, I would think the council would use that, or my suggestion would be to kind of use that as the litmus test of, all right, if, you know, how much are we going to generate off this project if we're going to get $3 million in Leverage Act dollars as a result of what they do? Okay, maybe a $3 million incentive is what we might consider to payable out over time, you know, from the revenues as they come in. So, and again, any given project, it's, you know, it's hard to predict what might be necessary or appropriate, but ultimately the city council would have those final decisions.
These numbers seem huge, and they are, but the way I look at it is kind of like you described earlier, you know, if the TIF just does outstandingly and we can afford to do all these things, that's what that number's for. It's the pie in the sky, like, hey, this is what if we had all the money coming in that we could use, this is what we'd accomplish with it. Realistically, it's not gonna do that. But if we don't identify it, we won't know if it does generate enough, we won't know what to do, we won't be able to explain why we needed a TIF to do these things, and we don't have a reason to bring in revenue. And these are the reasons to bring in revenue, to fix this stuff. That's the way I'm looking at it.
I have a question. Have you figured in inflation for the future? What it is today, this sounds great, but in 25 years, that ain't gonna be enough to cover a lot of things. Did you put inflation in that?
Yeah, so that's basically what that 20% contingency number is intended to
Take care of
represent.
inflation?
And again, I mean, that's, you know, if we're lucky, that's 5 to 10 years worth of inflation. You know, the rate we've been going in recent years, that's not gonna, you'd burn through that pretty quick with inflation, but hopefully that's slowing down in the coming years. So, I mean, Scott, I don't know if it totally puts you on the spot in all of those different numbers. Again, those different improvement totals are, again, a composite of multiple different engineering or planning studies that have been done at different times over the last, probably 10 to 12 years or so. And so some of those numbers, you know, were maybe a 2015 number that's been extrapolated forward into today's dollars. So what we hope is that the amounts in the 4 lines on the top represent today's dollars cost, and then we've got that contingency amount to help deal with infrastructure.
Okay.
Or I'm sorry, to deal with inflation.
And when you start building some projects and, you know, water lines or whatever, can you stipulate that you'll use local people if at all possible within that budget? Or do you have to take bids from all over the place?
I mean, typically, under most circumstances, if the city is directing the infrastructure projects, they're going to have to competitively bid them, and they're going to be obligated to award to the lowest bidder, lowest responsible bidder, and, you know, that's a city's determination as to, you know, what that comprises.
Is that a law? Is that a law you have to do that?
Yes. Yeah. Cities are required to competitively bid public construction contracts in excess of $100,000, I think is the current statutory amount. So, you know, you would think that when, you know, maybe a large contractor, if it's a large project, a larger contractor hopefully is going to use more local subs, because that's going to help them keep their bid costs down. If they don't have a lot of people that are having to travel, you know, I don't think it's possible to determine today that, you know, would we do a $100 million water project all at the same time? For this purpose, no, probably not. It might be a whole bunch of, you know, $1 million or $2 million projects. And at that size, that might attract more local contractors. You know, a large national contractor is probably not going to come to Chickasha for $1 million construction contract. But again, I think that there's kind of that balance of, yes, you want to see local used as much as possible, but at the same time, there's the other side of taxpayer dollars. You don't want to pay twice as much for the same project just to have it be all local people that are working on it. But again, ultimately, that's all process that comes through the city council for them to determine.
Is there any way to know, like, we know that's the big picture, is there any way to know the minimum that would be necessary in order to support economic development?
As promised, we get into the engineering project, I'm gonna let the engineer talk.
Good afternoon, Scott Vaughn, excuse me, Chisholm Truck Consulting. You really kind of have to look at each case on a case-by-case basis. You know, we can give you estimated costs per foot of water line or per foot of sanitary sewer main, but you really kind of need to know where that economic development location is. If you're, for instance, looking at the area out east of town near I-44 and 62, then yes, if we knew that specific corner, we can give you a cost estimate for that. If you're looking at a location downtown, we can evaluate that too and give you a specific, if you know a specific building you wanted to look at, for instance, then we could give you a cost estimate for that.
I think from a planning perspective too, I mean, what projects are immediately necessary are largely driven by which development projects are actually proposed to move forward, that are certain projects, and what specifically needs to be done in order to support that project or that group of projects, balanced with some maybe economy of scale that, you know, if we need to replace this segment of line, does it make sense to finish the balance of that line all as one project versus just doing that segment? And then also, you know, what projects may build on each other. You know, for instance, development that's going out in the east of town, what is the optimal solution of infrastructure to support development on the east side along the Highway 62 corridor? But if that's the optimal solution, does it put an undue strain on other portions of the system, maybe downtown, that also need to be upgraded in order to support that on a pass-through basis? So again, there's a lot of balancing there, a lot of moving parts. Next slide. Okay, and we covered most of this already. So about $10.5 million in projected ad valorem revenues, split 50-50, 57.2 million sales tax, split up 3.44 in hotel tax, and then the Leverage Act projects an additional 30.32, and that's just the sum of the half of sales tax and the half of the hotel tax. Oversight of TIF revenues, city manager is listed as the person in charge of implementation. The city council has to approve public agreements with developers as appropriate, and the city would, again, capture the revenues, but then would disperse revenue back to the taxing entities based on their respective share of the ad valorem revenues. We've talked about the assistance in development financing. Again, it's a direct incentive representing reimbursement of public infrastructure costs incurred by the developer on behalf of the city. It could also be a direct incentive to that particular developer, as we've talked about. There would be a public development agreement that's approved by the city and or public trust on behalf of the city in each of those instances. And then infrastructure projects. See, we got to the next slide and this answered a bunch of the questions that came up. Public construction contracts are subject to competitive bidding approved by the city and subject to city's annual audit processes. Expected impacts of projects. Impacts on taxing entities could potentially include increase in population or students and associated needs like capital infrastructure and service demands. Taxing entity revenue allocation to other taxing entities helps provide enhanced funding. And again, that's the 5.27 million that's projected based on our set of revenue assumptions that would go back to the taxing jurisdictions. And it's actually on the exhibit to the resolution that we'll get to here in a minute. But out of that 5.27 million, approximately 3.7 million of that's allocated to the school district as the largest taxer of all the ad valorem levies. Destination experiences could potentially attract increased visitors to the city that result in new spending within the city, enhances sales and hotel tax collections, benefiting the city's ability to fund other public improvements. And then ancillary development outside the TIF districts may generate additional revenue for taxing. I think there's supposed to be another word there, taxing entities. Additional expected impacts, new investment in business creation, new business inside the increment districts will create short-term and long-term employment opportunities, results in increased spending within the city benefiting local businesses. Destination experiences attract increased visitors. And those visitors have new spending within the city that enhances opportunities for local merchants to provide additional goods and services. And this is a proposed schedule moving forward. So again, we've met a number of times over the first half of the year as the review committee, and we'll talk here in a minute more about the project plan and the resolution. And initially, just looking at schedule, we were thinking maybe come back in 3 weeks, giving everybody a chance to review and digest, and then hopefully at that June 19th meeting, again tentatively, this committee be in a position to make a final recommendation in the form of the resolution. And based on that, we would anticipate we would have it on the Planning Commission agenda at their regular meeting July 9th, have the 2 public hearings at the regularly scheduled city council meetings in August on the 5th and the 19th, those are Mondays, and then have the city council consider adoption of the ordinance at its September 3rd regular meeting, which is a Tuesday because of the Labor Day holiday. So that's, again, we're not declaring to be bound to that necessarily, but that's kind of a proposed timeline that we've worked out with staff moving forward that I think makes sense, moves towards a resolution of process, but at the same time gives ample time for review and feedback from everyone involved. That's the end of the presentation. We can have any questions right now, if there are, or I can lead you quickly through the project plan, then I'll leave you to read through it on your own time. Okay, so project plan set up on page 1. You've got a description of the project. Page 2 is discussion of the project area and increment district boundaries. Page 3 talks about the eligibility of the project, identifies the enterprise zone tracks, and then also states the objectives. On page 4, there's a kind of a summary of the financial impacts as it relates to the different taxing jurisdictions. There's more detail in the resolution, but so this is really just a summary of what's in that resolution. If you get over to page 6, you've got principal actions, and then section 7 on page 6 is the actual establishment of the increment district. And so it contemplates creating 2 different increment districts, the 2 areas that we've identified. There we go. So the 2 different areas that we've identified, in the blue is the downtown and the green is the Highway 62 corridor. Talks about establishing a commencement date, which would be a date determined in the future by the city council. Again, it could be September 3rd. If they want to commence it at that date, they could do that, or it could be at some later date within 10 years of that, where they would commence it, and then it could run for 25 full fiscal years following that commencement. And then it talks about 100% of the ad valorem revenues being captured, 50% of the projects, 50% back to the taxing jurisdictions, 50% of the sales tax, and that'd be whatever the tax rate happens to be. Right now it's 4.25%, so that would be 2.125 that's actually captured by the TIF district. The balance of that, as written, that other 2.125 would just go back proportionately to all the different taxing ordinances that the city has in place. The 50% of sale or of the hotel tax would be captured. You saw the highlighted in the sales tax on page 7. I was struggling to find the reference in the Code of Ordinances on the city, so we'll get that filled into a final draft for a couple of weeks from now. The 50% of the hotel tax, so that's 4 out of the current 8% hotel tax. Again, same with sales tax. If the hotel tax gets raised to 10%, then the TIF would capture 5%. If the hotel tax gets dropped at an election to 4%, then the TIF would only capture 2%. So it would just be half of whatever the tax rate is. And then 100% of the Leverage Act dollars as are determined by the state. Provides project and increment district authorizations. In Section 8, Section 9 is a high-level view of the budget of the different project cost elements, infrastructure and the incentive costs, organizational costs, debt service costs. Then on page 10, we get into the mechanics of how the TIF actually captures revenue. And an important element here, we've got 2 different TIF districts. We've got this larger common project area. So any of the revenues generated within either of the TIF districts could be used for project costs in either or both of the TIF districts or in that outside within the project area. So you can kind of think of it as like two TIFs that are helping pay for whatever they can. If one develops faster, that potentially helps with infrastructure costs and the other one to get that one going as well. So we get into, potential methods of financing. Basically everything's on the table for what the city could potentially do, whether they pay as they go, or finance it through different vehicles. The sources of revenue, the ad valorem, sales tax, hotel tax, leverage act. Again, there's some of it as you read it, you'll see some of the paragraphs start to say the same thing. I haven't figured out a good way to kind of consolidate that without it getting harder to follow versus easier. But again, that's the mechanics of how the revenues are captured and where they go, where they flow to. Time when costs are to be obligated. This is one of the things that after I sent this out, I thought about this. It's not going to be 2 to 3 years. I would probably change that within approximately 10 years. This is at the bottom of page 15.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
On the map, I can't tell where I'm at, but does the red box include the airport? So it does not?
I don't think it does, no.
Okay.
I'm not sure how far south the airport property extends and if any of it maybe gets picked up in that top corner, but I think it's further up. I remember seeing it on the overheads, but I think it's further to the north and west.
So is that Highway 81 that's on the far left top? Is that Highway 81?
That's 81 going to the north.
Right.
And then 81 to the south is more kind of the center.
sorry, wasn't trying to derail, I just
No,
wondered.
that's all right. Okay, and then on page 16, we've got a summary of the total financing revenue sources. There's a blank that I forgot to fill in, that's 5.27. I welcome any editorial typos or anything. If anybody sees anything, just communicate those back to Keith or Susan, and we'll get them cleaned up. On page 18, the public revenue, total revenue, that's 35.6 million that we've talked about, not including Leverage Act, potential matching funds, then the public and private investment in the project, zoning conditions, most of increment and I guess I didn't mention that, but in the project plan, we've referred to increment district A and increment district B. At some point, when they activate that, that would become increment district number 2 and increment district number 3. Which one of those, blue is A and green is B, for purposes of identification in here. The city activates the green area first, that'll be TIF 2, and the blue one would be TIF 3. So just so you understand that, but we do that so we've got a designation, but technically it doesn't have a number until it's been activated per the statutes. So the zoning conditions, obviously the downtown area is pretty much all commercial. You've got a mix of commercial, industrial, and agricultural zoning out in the green area, and then the city would certainly look at zoning changes as appropriate to support development as agriculture gets put in service for industrial and or commercial development. And then annual reports on an annual basis at the end of each fiscal year. The city puts together a summary report of the revenues that have been collected, what's been spent, and that's provided to the taxing jurisdictions. A summary of it's published in the paper. So again, there's the funds will be audited as part of their normal auditing process, but there's just kind of a separate summary report that's made available to the public as well, and to the taxing jurisdictions. On Exhibit A, we've got the project area map that you see. Exhibit B, we have the legal description of the project area, and again, kind of make this real simple. We just do it on the section line basis, which makes the legal description really short and really easy. And then Exhibit C, we've got the maps of increment area A and increment area B. And then one of the things we'll be efforting towards, not later than the time the city would actually adopt the TIF ordinance, would be increment district boundary legal description that provides the outer boundary of each of those increment districts. And so what we have in the project plan right now, we don't have a composite legal description, but we do have all of the parcels that have been identified that comprise those areas. And so in the blue area, that's really small, there's, would you believe, 302 different parcels that are in that. But then in the green area, that's much larger, there's actually only 63 parcels. So obviously much larger parcels as you get out towards the interstate. But so anyways, so there's information in your exhibits there that provide summary, identify each of those parcels, a shorthand legal description, and who the record owners are. And I see what I put in there. My apologies. There's actually on that, there's also what their valuation was for that property and what the approximate taxes paid for 2023 in there. But I didn't realize that when I printed it to PDF, it cut all that off. And so,
Is that project area all part of the city of Chickasha?
no, I think some of the project area is outside of the city limits. So the increment district has to be within the corporate boundaries of the city. The project area doesn't. Again, we don't anticipate that there's work that needs to be done in every last corner of that. But it kind of makes it easier for visual representation and just a descriptor to just pick up the sections or the half sections and draw a box around the area. I know there's anticipation that, you know, some of the utility infrastructure, water, sewer, and or drainage would likely extend well outside the boundaries of either of the increment districts that are necessary to support what would be going on inside the increment districts. And so we just drew the box big enough to pick up everything in any particular area. So again, doesn't mean everything would be torn up within that red box. It just means anywhere within that red box is where there might be project activities potentially going.
So TIF money could go anywhere in that red box?
Yeah. Again, for project costs that are related to,
Right.
So, I mean, that's a good point of clarification. I mean, we wouldn't just do a street improvement in the southwest corner of the box there that had nothing to do with the project.
Right.
But again, you know, the examples might be if you need to replace a longer segment of water line or upsize a water line that's being put in over a longer segment, we'd want that area broad enough that we pick that up. But yeah, it does need to be a project related to what's going on within the increment districts.
So I'm just gonna ask this, if it's outside the city limits and it's like in the county, would the county help pay for part of the projects?
If the project costs that were necessary were outside the corporate boundaries and it's a project that the county might benefit from having that improvement done as well, then certainly they could contribute, and I would anticipate the city would ask for them to help contribute to that project in that instance, if you want to speak to that.
Good example might be our raw water coming in from Fort Cobb to the city's water treatment plant. Most of that's gonna be well outside of this area. But let's say we had to make some improvements close to the water treatment plant as we're building the new one, that cut across our easement that may be on private land or county outside the city, then conceptually, the city would be required to pay for most of that. But if we're outside of the city limits, the county may be willing to participate in some way if it benefits them.
Okay.
I know it's probably not, and it's something I can look up later, but I would be interested in seeing that red box in relation to a larger map, like the city limits of Chickasha, like in relation to where the airport is. Like I don't even know where the Currituck is on that map. I think I know where it's at, but
I'm gonna say,
oh, no, I didn't know where it was.
yeah, the airport's gonna be you see that? 81 comes up here and turn on to the airport up there.
Got it, okay.
But we could certainly provide a map that shows city limit overlay.
Is the airport in the city limits?
Rachel, do you know the answer? Is the airport entirely within the city limits and the?
Is it-
and
I just,
the
I don't know where the city limits are.
Industrial park land, that's all within city limits, yeah. The city map has some kind of spider
City
limits
limits,
Oh, yeah.
on the northeast.
but there's a
and northwest.
fence line that goes up. If you know what fence line means, there's a large area that goes pretty far west and very far north that is Chickasha city limits, but then there's a whole bunch of area inside of that that's not, has not been annexed to the city, and so it's actually outside city limits. And so you see the concept of a fence line, it kind of runs up, and the idea of that is so that another municipality doesn't come in and gobble up all the land right next to you and kind of lock you in. So that's future area that Chickasha could grow into if it so chose to.
So like the city limits of Chickasha is bigger than that red box, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, all of this down here, for example, would be in city limits.
Okay.
Parts that you don't see some over here as well.
And that's something we could add in if that'd be helpful.
I was just wondering if.
I could probably find a map that, I mean, I know I can get a map that shows the overall city limits, and then we could approximate where the project area is and where but again, the project area does not have to all be within the city limits, but the increment district does. So that's why a lot of where you see that north boundary of the green increment B, that's where the city limits is. Most of that kind of runs along the river for a while, and city limits run right up along the interstate, and it picks up the, I guess now the Loves and McDonald's is there. That's in the city limits as well, but there's just a strip that runs up the middle of the turnpike to get there. So again, very common for most municipalities to have things like that.
Thank you.
Exhibit E has just kind of a general description of the project, and then talks about overall description of water, sewer, stormwater, and street bridge improvements. Again, did not try to create a comprehensive list of all the different things. I mean, the answer, Scott left. I mean, the answer is, you know, which water lines or sewer lines downtown need to be replaced. I think the answer is probably all of them. But so we didn't try to list every single line. But and then towards the end on page E4, you've got a summary of the development assumptions that were used to generate the revenues or revenue projections that were used for this. And then in Exhibit F, one of the things that we'll look to add that we haven't yet is any potential conceptual layouts of any development projects that are potentially proposed at this point, to the extent that a prospective developer is willing to allow them to be included at this point. And then Exhibit G, conditions and uses of real property. I plan to have a copy of the zone, or a portion of the zoning map that shows what the current zoning is out there, and then that's actually an area we could add in just an overall corporate boundaries map of the city, just for reference. I think would be helpful, so we'll look at doing that. Any other questions on the project plan? Again, I know I don't expect you to have all your detailed questions right now, so you can look at that. The resolution that's been drafted, it makes a recommendation to the city council that the project plan be adopted and the city move forward with the process of adopting or creating the TIF districts. But it has it starts off with a number of whereas, statutory references, and then discusses in Section 1 the eligibility. Section 2 makes approvals and recommendations relative to different findings. And so there's a number of statutory findings that, one, relate to the appropriateness of the project, and then two, there's some specific parameters that the net assessed value of all taxable property in all increment districts within the city not exceed 35% of the net assessed value of taxable property within the city. That well under that with this. That it not exceed 25% of the net assessed value of any school districts in the county or in the city, also well under that. That it not take more than 25% of the total land area of the city, and it's well, that's a larger number, but it's still well under that. If my recollection was like 6 or 7%, so well under the threshold there. And part of what those means is there's a judiciousness of not tying up all of your potential to create future TIF districts if the right project came along. There would still be, there's plenty of land area and valuation room to be able to create another TIF district if the right project came along and the city went through a similar process and was ultimately determined to do so. Section 3 has a summary of the financial impact, description of the project in Section B, and then as you get into Section C, there's a blow-by-blow. I know Chloe, you might be the only one here that's been on a committee that's been here, so she knows I've used that expression before, a blow-by-blow discussion of every single tax levy from each of the taxing jurisdictions, sales tax, hotel tax, ad valorem, and the different types of levies that are taken by the county, the school, the health department, and the technology center, what their current levy rates are. Again, we've assumed for purposes of projecting revenues that all of the levies stay as they are. Most of them are going to. Certainly sales tax or hotel tax could change at any time. The city, for ad valorem purposes, it's generally only if there's a sinking fund levy change, if the school issues more bonds, if the city went out and approved geo bonds, if the county or the technology center, anybody like that approved that, then you might have a sinking fund levy. Those are usually the only changes year over year in tax levies at the ad valorem level. And
Can I ask a question?
Uh-huh.
So I was involved in the Blanchard TIF committee as well, and that one seemed to be like detailed as far as like development plans and future plans, and this one seems more generic. Will we get to a point where we talk about that, or are we just keeping this one pretty generic?
I mean, this one is fairly generic.
Okay.
Because again, we've got a fairly, I would say a larger area of development than what we had. And in that instance, we had a specific developer that's proposing specific projects. And so, I mean, they were pretty far along as far as exactly what they wanted to do. And, you know, that was helpful in that it allowed us to extrapolate out revenues, probably a better degree of certainty. Assuming they do what they said they were going to do, we should realize pretty close to this level of revenue. You know, here it's much more of a challenge because we have a handful of initial prospects, but what the city's really trying to accomplish is just an overall larger redevelopment of downtown and development of that corridor, period. And I don't think there are any specific prospects for the corridor at this point. Most of the existing projects all relate to the downtown area. So, yeah, it's a good question, but it's kind of a product of what the city's trying to accomplish and where it is in the process.
And a question on pending legislation. Is there any pending legislation out there that could impact the decision that the city makes as far as TIF goes? Over the years, I think there's been laws changed. Yeah, there have not been any, what I would say, major changes to the TIF structure. I mean, I think every year there are bills introduced that propose some significant changes, but I mean, most of the time they don't move forward. There's a lot of bills that get introduced that don't move forward. I would say the one that we see most commonly introduced that I would think would be the biggest change is if it becomes a requirement that the taxing jurisdictions have to formally approve participation in a TIF district. And the way the state law reads right now, ad valorem taxes, this is an advisory body. So you're represented, but you're making an advisory recommendation. The city has the ability with a supermajority to go in and override. If you say, don't do this, the city has the ability to override that with a supermajority and adopt the TIF anyways. And in that instance, it would put the mechanism in place and it would capture the TIF revenue. And there's nothing you can do about it, basically. There's legislation that's been proposed periodically over the years to change that. For example, with sales tax, you do specifically have to get the county's consent to capture some portion of the county sales tax to participate in a TIF district. you do have to get the state's consent to capture any of the state's sales tax. The state has actually put that mechanism in place through the Leverage Act. So that is their consent. If they determine there's that net benefit, then they will participate in it. But with respect to ad valorem, there's not, so.
If there was some changes and we finished the process, or during the process from the city, would we be grandfathered in after we finished the project?
I would sure hope so. I mean, I think that's a hard question to answer because, you know,
Thank you.
The answer is it depends, and I don't know for sure. It would depend on exactly what they did in the legislation. You would think that they would not retrospectively impact things that have already been done, but they could. So.
Thank you.
So on the resolution then, if you kind of flip back all the way to the very back, then there's an Exhibit A and an Exhibit B that provides a summary of the tax revenues that are generated, sales tax, hotel tax, and then on Exhibit B, you've got the ad valorem tax, and it's broken out on a levy by levy basis. And so it shows, you know, how much of the revenues are captured in the maximum year. So that's, you know, whatever year, probably towards the end where the total taxes generated is the most. And then what's the 25-year total of that. And then you see the allocation back to the taxing entities, which again, in this case, is just half of that number. So it's pretty easy to calculate. And then at the bottom, there's a summary allocation, 50% to the TIF projects. And you see a maximum year, and then the total over the 25-year time horizon, and then also for each of the individual taxing entities. Again, that's based on what their current levy rates are relative to the total levy. So if the levy rates change, then those amounts allocated in that particular year would change a little bit along with it. That's the project plan, and that's the resolution. So happy to field any questions, discussion, or the chair pleases on that.
Will you speak briefly about why 25 years?
25 years is the maximum time horizon that's allowed by statute. The city could ultimately adopt a TIF district for a shorter duration, have an expiration date that's a shorter time horizon. If they did so, they would have the ability to go in and amend that at a later date and stretch it out to the full 25 years. I think the biggest rationale here is, given the scale of the infrastructure needs and the relative amount of actual projected investment, the farther out in time you get, the more revenues there tend to be as you get more and more development. And then I think it's kind of the, all right, we'll do a 50-50 TIF for 25 years as opposed to doing 100% TIF for 12 or 13 years. So it gives an opportunity, it's kind of the balance of opportunity to share the revenues with the taxing jurisdictions and at the same time provide a long enough development time horizon that there's meaningful revenues that are captured towards the end to help recoup some of the costs.
Okay, thank you.
Nate, I got a quick question on that similar note. The city could adopt a TIF period for 25 years. They could also adopt one for 10 years and come in later and extend it an additional 15?
Yes.
Okay. So if they adopt it for 15 initially, could they come in and say, we only want to go back to 10? They want to reduce that?
Well, the way the project plans are written is if you accomplish all the objectives of the plan and you pay all of the project costs before you get to the expiration date, then the TIF just expires early. So it would only go to the 25 years to the extent that you haven't paid, you know, 380 or 580 some odd $1 million worth of project costs. But yes, I mean, the city could certainly, if they chose, they could set that date for a shorter time period. And, you know, again, the other element that we've got is we're not commencing it necessarily immediately. So it might be a year from now or 2 years from now before you commence that. Then it could go for up to 25 years from that date. And again, potentially as far as, you know, if you waited till 2034 to commence it, then in theory it could go all the way out to 2069, 2070, so. So the directive of the review committee is to review the project plan and then make a recommendation to the city council whether or not they should adopt it as it's written, don't adopt it, or adopt it with maybe certain conditions or stipulations put in place. So, I mean, this body has the ability to, for example, say, it's all good, but we only want it to be 15 years or 20 years. We want that to be the time horizon. What we will probably do, I mean, unless staff tells me otherwise, my anticipation is that we would probably conform the project plan to what this body's recommendation is, and then move it forward, and then the Planning Commission would review it. We'd have the public hearings based on what's been recommended between those two bodies, and then the City Council would adopt that. And at that point in time, the City Council would have the choice to either accept the recommendations and they could adopt the ordinance on a simple majority vote, or they could do something that's different from what was recommended to them by the bodies and what the general public comments were, and they could adopt that by a 2/3 majority, and that's kind of they could do whatever they want based on a 2/3 majority.
So if we did something like 10 years, and then the 10 years were up and you found out that because you don't have a lot of projects identified yet, you found out that really the economic development's going to be more towards the airport or something like that. I guess you could do a new, either way you could do it, could you? You would just be doing a new TIF?
Yeah, so I mean, you could do a different TIF out towards the airport, for example. That would probably be the scenario there. If you had a time horizon that was shorter than the maximum allowed, you could go in and you could extend the existing TIFs out to that maximum time horizon. I've had instances where project plans were created, maybe they were very specific for a certain project that everybody thought was going to move forward, and then it didn't, and the project imploded, and they got 10 years down the road and there was something else, but it was different and it required different parameters. You know, I've actually gone in where we've ended the increment district that was created that wasn't generating anything, and at that point kind of wipes the slate clean, and then we've created a new TIF district that's going to be at whatever the current base assessed value is versus what it was 10 years or so ago. And so just kind of reset the day, which would allow us a full 25 years from that date if that were appropriate, but would, you know, as opposed to trying to modify something and kind of make it fit and only having 10 or 15 years left on it. I mean, one of the things I'd say with respect to too much shorter than 25 years in this instance is that a lot of the development projections that we've made anticipate development that occurs in 2030 or even 2035, because again, we're not dealing with a project that is kind of waiting in the wings and has a pro forma that's ready to go at a certain date. We're kind of projecting in the future what things could happen and what's a reasonable date that we can set far enough out in the future. So we don't have a ton of TIF revenue being generated until we get, you know, closer to 2035, 2036 in that time horizon. So, you know, if we shorten it to 10 or 15 years, now we're talking about only a couple of years worth of actual revenue being captured.
And even if we do it at 25 years, you can end the TIF.
Yeah, a city.
Like again,
It-
if
it
that's
would
not
end
where
if it's-
the economic development is, and so you don't really need that anymore, but there's another area, you can end that and then do the other one. So there's no reason to do a 10-year, because if something like that happened, you could still just end it even though it was 25
Yeah, the
years.
city's always got the ability to go in and make an amendment to the TIF district. And again, if it's anything other than, they can do a minor amendment, which increases the total cost by not more than 5%, increases the land area by not more than 5%, or doesn't make a substantial change in the nature of the TIF district. So, for example, as opposed to a retail corridor, it's going to be a giant oil refinery. I'm not saying that's a real thing, but just for, that would be something obviously that's completely different than what's contemplated here if there were a need to make a change to conform to that. So any change beyond those minor amendment points would require the city council to reconvene this review committee process and go back through that and make a formal recommendation as to the amendment, have public hearings, and then come back before the city before they took that action. And I've always gone through that same process where a city decided we need to kill this TIF because it's not going to work, and we either have something else that we want to replace it with, or we just want to kill it and make it go away, and then in the future maybe that we've at least cleared the table off. And so they go through that same process of review committee makes that recommendation, yeah, let's get rid of it, we don't need it, it's not accomplishing anything, it's not going to, and have our hearings, and then the city would actually take action to formally terminate it.
I know 25 years sounds like a long time, and it is, but I believe that was the logic behind the 50-50 split, to ensure that the community partners grow along with. Instead of a 90-10 or a 75-25, it was a 50-50 to make sure that the taxing entities get their share of the new growth and development as well. And I believe there's a logic behind why that was.
Yeah, that's right.
So on this resolution, item number 4, I mean, it says consider and take action. I mean, do we need to do something? I was going to say, we need to review all this.
I'm assuming the committee does not want to go ahead and vote on this today.
No, I'm going to need about a month and a half to read it.
I would assume you want to take this home and review it and think about it. Then we'll come back, so. I've had committees that said, no, we don't want to come back, we're ready now, so that's kind of why it's worded that way. But again, you just got that today, so my expectation is that you'll come back.
I would also interject that as you are reviewing this, you may have questions that you don't want to wait until the next review committee meeting. Feel free to bring those to me and we'll make sure we get an answer.
Yeah, please do, in fact.
Without going too far forward, what will the hearings look like? I mean, how will that go?
Yeah, so the requirement is we will publish a notice in the paper, and that notice has to be published at least 14 days in advance of the first hearing, and it'll have a picture of the maps, and it'll have kind of general legal description of the area we're talking about and the summary of it. And then we'll have a presentation that will be similar to this presentation, if not pretty close to the same thing, at that hearing. And then so we'll do a presentation, and then the purpose of the first hearing is for the public to ask questions and get answers. That's what it says in the statute. The purpose of the second hearing is for public comment. So again, that's kind of the discretion of the mayor, or whoever's administering the hearing. We plan to have them during the city council meetings, which I think is always beneficial because it gives the city council the opportunity to get a full presentation of what everybody else has been looking at that point in time, and they can also ask questions. And then based on the questions, I mean, there may be feedback that is received that, we make some changes, the city decides to tweak things. And then based on what those changes are, it may or may not be appropriate to have it come back to the review committee. If there's, a significant push from the council that says, hey, we want we want to go back and we want the taxing entities to consider a 75-25 split. Either way you pick. You know, then we might want to send it back and get that formal feedback. Or they might just say, you know what, we want to do what we want to do, and they could just go ahead and take their action that way. But yeah, that's the plan for the hearings, is a presentation and then just an opportunity for questions and for input.
Anything else? Okay.
The hearings, they usually get somewhere between 0 and 300 people. I've had both ends of that.
Well, there's a lot of conceptions about TIFs, and there's been a lot of TIFs that have been done the wrong way, so I'm sure the public's gonna have a lot of questions that this TIF is being done the right way, and rightly so.
And at the point in time that, once this body makes their recommendation, and the planning commission has made their recommendation, part of that notice process of the hearings, that hearing notice will also be posted online on the city's website. The project plan at that point will be posted on the city's website, so people will be able to see that document well in advance of the hearings as well. We typically don't post it much before then, just because it's still a working draft right now. So we would anticipate we'll have a final draft for you, or a very near to final draft. So again, if there are any questions or feedback, or you look on page E something or other and see that the first 2 letters of a word are capitalized, there's one in there, you can look for it. I've already found it, but so if you see a typo, please pass those along. I'd much rather get them corrected now. So.
Does anybody else have any more questions or anything?
Are we expected to be at all of the meetings that were on that list?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, once this body makes its recommendation, you are invited to come to the public hearings, but you are not obligated to do so. So sometimes if you think you're going to, let us know, because if we think we're going to have enough of the review committee there to have a quorum, we'll actually post a notice of a meeting, and purpose of the meeting is to participate in the public hearing. You wouldn't be taking any action, but we'll just do kind of a notice there. But no, you're not obligated to come to those, but you're welcome to.
Can we see those dates again? Or are they written in our stuff somewhere?
Oops, went too far. I don't even know what I did now. There we go.
Right there.
So is June 19th set in stone?
Yeah.
Is that?
That's not. That was just a suggestion. The Wednesday time frame has seemed to work for everybody. I think we're flexible around that. If we thought we wanted to come back June 12th, that's 2 weeks instead of 3 weeks. I can't be here on the 26th because I get to go on vacation for a week and a half that afternoon.
That 19th, unless my calendar's wrong, that's Juneteenth.
Mm-hmm.
So
It is.
The city is closed
Yeah,
the June.
we might want to
June
reconsider
19th.
that.
Yeah, and we talked about that in our meeting, or when we were talking yesterday. So again,
I won't be available that week either, but we could appoint a sub as well, if that's okay with you.
yeah, we could do that.
Did you say the 12th was another option?
The 12th is a Wednesday as well. That's 2 weeks. It's kind of a question of
No?
I can't.
how long does this body
With the
think
12th?
they need? The 12th works fine for me.
Is that gonna give everybody enough time to digest this document? If we do it on the 12th?
Probably not.
Do some speed reading. Take it on vacation with me.
Just 2 weeks, isn't it?
June 12th is,
Yeah, 2 weeks.
Does June 12th work for everybody?
It's good for me.
Yes.
Okay, let's do June 12th, Susan. If that works.
At 1:30?
Yeah, same time, 1:30, yeah.
And that's when we'll make the final vote, recommendation.
Yes, and as you saw, there's a couple of blanks on purpose and a couple of blanks not on purpose, and so we'll get those cleaned up, and by middle of next week, I'll get you an updated draft of the project plan and the resolution. Again, I'm not anticipating, if there's any substantive changes, I'll redline them for you, but I anticipate it's just filling in some things that we didn't have.
Anybody have any other questions or anything?
So these dates are tentative to our our recommendation, correct?
Yeah, so
Like as long as we
again,
make that recommendation by June 19th, those will be the dates.
yeah, we would anticipate, because again, trying to hit regular meetings, the July 9th Planning Commission, because I think the Planning Commission meeting is Tuesday the 11th. And so what we wanted to do was get this body's recommendation, so that way we can show the Planning Commission what you've already signed off on. And then once both of those are in place, then we publish our notice. And so we just talked about targeting those two in August. So again, that gives ample time if for some reason we need to reconvene, or if something slides, we've got some time to work with.
So the June 12th meeting is when we'll make our recommendation.
Yeah, that would be the intention.
Everybody good?
Is that 1:30 again?
Yeah. All right, I think we're done.
Okay.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can those slides, are they available anywhere?
Yeah, she's,
I have them, I can forward them, or make copies for you, or send them to you, however you wish to get
You
them.
just email them to everybody, that'd be fine.
I can do that.
All right, item 5, I will take a motion to adjourn, or item 6, I'm sorry.
I'll make a motion, Kirkpatrick.
Second?
Second, we're adjourned.